So we resume the postdoctoral session this afternoon, and we start with the third presentation. The presentation will be delivered by Jędrzej Olejniczak, PhD student from the University of Wrocław. Now we will have a literary, to some extent, perspective on translation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hey, good afternoon. So my presentation is going to be, in a sense, out of line because it doesn't really correspond to the previous ones in, I guess, any way. So I'm a bit stressed out about that, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to tell you a few words about how I got started with corpora. So there is this quite, I suppose, within the English studies at least, there's this well-known novel by David Lodge, Small World, and there is a character there, namely Robert Frobisher, who takes his, who is a writer, who takes his work to linguistics department at his university, and they study his work, and they tell him that his most commonly used word in every work he writes is Greece, and he can't write any novel after that. So I figured, okay, I would, it's actually quite thrilling to think about, and decided to look for some Greece myself in other books. So let's get started with some, with my main focus as far as my research goes. So look at a couple of things in my corpora. So I studied translators' style, both for, especially of particular translators. I also have a look at the concept of translation-ese, the way that Baker suggested it, and I do look at interference in translation between Polish and English. The first 2 points I'm going to cover today. The third one is just going to be mentioned quite scarcely because it's a very complex issue and it will require, I guess, about an hour to be fully explained. Right, so the first things first. So I'd like to very briefly say what translation-ese is. So translation-ese assumes that, well, when translators translate, they produce a text which is perhaps a bit different than natural text produced in a given language. So imagine that you have texts which have been translated from English into Polish, and you can perhaps, that's what translation-ese assumes, you can group them together and they'll be a bit different than the texts that are naturally written in Polish. Right? That's the basic idea for translation-ese. So I figured, I was wondering how this can even be measured, and I arrived at corpus linguistics, which provides enough tools to allow for statistical examination of works, of literature mostly, because I do study literary work, and that's what my corpora are built of. Yeah, all right. So we're going to have a look at translation-ese. Now, there are a couple of research hypotheses here. So I assume that translation-ese does exist and that it can be measured. I'm going to show you some data that perhaps indicate that this is indeed the case. I do look at the style of translators, and I do assume that the translators, each of the translators does leave their mark on the text, and those marks can also be measured and defined. And thirdly, the core hypothesis for this particular paper is that the translator's style will remain mostly intact when they create their own works. So when you have a translator between English and Polish who writes their own books in Polish, those books will carry similar style to the works that that translator has translated, right? In order to examine, in order to carry out my corpus research, I use two main tools. Firstly, Wordsmith Tools 6.0 for specific corpus research, and then RStylo for stylometry and statistics. So as far as stylometric research goes, so the RStylo use, it makes it possible to compare texts based on those certain style markers. Those markers are, for instance, most frequent words, which seems to be a very plain and simple statistic, but indeed it does turn out to be much more powerful than one would have thought. And then I also look at the n-grams, as in the reoccurring clusters of n words. So for instance, a bigram is a cluster of 2 words. So those are the I feel those are the most universal tools that you can measure one's style with. Okay, as far as my corpora go, I've built two main large corpora, the Polish native literary fiction corpus, which starts roughly in 1970s and contains works from 1970s until now, and also a literary fiction translation corpus, which is about 1.8 million words, and again, it's literature translated from English into Polish. And I do use those smaller corpora as well, as in I built some more specialized corpora using those two main ones for specific research I conduct. Okay, so here are the works. You can probably have a look at those a bit later after the presentation because it would take a while to read them out. Anyway, so we're going to have a look at what our style of research produces now. So our style produces something called dendrograms. Those are like the tree graphs that indicate how certain sets of texts are similar to one another. So you'll see, I think I'm just going to jump to the dendrogram itself because that's the interesting part. So dendrogram looks like this. This is a dendrogram that represents two corpora. So in green, those are the corpora that have been translated from English into Polish, and in red, those are the native texts that have been written in Polish initially. All right? Dendrogram works like this. When you have a corpus, I think I'll just walk up. So the further any two lines cross one another, so those they group those texts, right? So when these two lines intersect in here, this means that this is where those texts are similar to this extent. And the closer to zero you get, the more similar any set of texts go. So for instance, if you have this set of the texts here, this means that these texts intersect very close to zero, meaning that those texts on this branch are very similar within this certain group. And those texts here, they're also very similar in certain stylistic ways. I'm going to talk you through those certain details in a second, but the thing about this is that this is the dendrogram for those two large corpora. One of them, the green texts, belong to the corpus of the texts which have been translated from English into Polish. And the red texts are the texts which have been natively written by Polish writers in Polish. So as you can see, this is very interesting because the texts are grouped in this perhaps even quite an unpredictable way, as in the natively written Polish texts are grouped together on one of the branches, and they kind of intersect very close to zero, meaning that they are very similar style-wise. Whereas the translations, they're grouped on another branch, and they're also similar to one another, but the difference between the translations and the native Polish text is actually quite huge. The main differences between the texts, as you know, there are two main categories of words. There are grammatical words which form a closed class, and there are also lexical words which are an open class. As you can guess, the most frequent words in every corpus are going to be the closed class words, as in the grammatical ones, so prepositions, conjuncts, and so on and so forth. Now you may ask, what data can you get out of conjuncts? Because they don't have a meaning of their own, really, right? That's the thing. Since conjuncts and, for instance, prepositions appear in almost every sentence, they actually function as basis for all the constructions in the language. Which means that if you can have a look at what particular constructions those for instance, prepositions create or conjuncts create, you can actually get a very reliable image of what the differences between those two groups of text, translations and native text, is. Alright, so the main differences as far as the Polish-English pair goes are the extensive use of reflexive voice in translated texts. So Polish has, you have active and passive voice in English. Polish also has reflexive voice. So those are the phrases that use the reflexive pronoun się. And reflexive voice is something that is commonly used in Polish, but in the translated text, there is approximately 30% more reflexive voice than in the native Polish text. There's also underuse of certain conjuncts and certain constructions related thereto as well. So those are the conjuncts such as bo, aby, lecz, and lub. And also there's underuse of certain prepositions in translation too. So the prepositions such as wy, o, od, and u do not appear. And this basically means, I have another paper in the works on the prepositions, so I'm not going to go much into detail here. But the basic idea here is that there are certain things that happen in translation, there are certain things that don't happen. We're going to talk about, I'm going to talk to you very briefly about through the keenness test as well. Keenness test is this specifically, is a test which is basically designed to measure the keywords in a text. It compares two corpora, and it basically indicates what the main core differences between the corpora are. Of course, when you talk about literary texts, the highest keenness values are usually assigned to proper names. But once you are able to eliminate those, you get a lot of interesting details which indicate what particular differences exist between, for instance, our corpus of literary texts and our corpus of translations of literary texts into Polish. Yeah, and basically the higher value of keenness is, that's what you need to know, the more pronounced the differences between any two corpora are. Okay, so here's just some data about those prepositions in Polish. You can see that they have quite high keenness values. You can see them to the right. So the keenness is between 40 and 100. When the keenness is around 100, this means that this difference is very highly statistically significant. Basically, the difference of 15 keenness is already almost certain to be not to be a statistical mistake, a statistical error, but rather something that is indeed the case. So this means that certain prepositions, for instance, are used in translation more often than in the native Polish text, and this means that there are certain constructions that do not really appear in translation as often as they would appear in the texts which are natively written in Polish. So briefly, let's have a look at the interference patterns as well between English and Polish. I have this one particular diagram, namely spojrzeć na in Polish, which roughly translates, accurately translates into look at in English. So you can see that this particular diagram has a very high keenness of 170 for the translated text, which obviously is, which I assume is because the phrase look at interferes from English into Polish very often, because it's just a very convenient way of translating this phrase, this diagram. That's basically one of those things that I've discovered. I like, many of those, but we don't really have time to discuss those today. Now, let's have a look at the translators' authored pieces written in Polish, contrasted with the other pieces in native Polish corpus. Now, we're going to have a look at another dendrogram now. Just that this dendrogram includes two words. It's quite difficult to find translators who also write something of their own, especially when we have translators of fiction who also write fiction themselves. Right? There are not so many of them, especially in the English-Polish pair. I was able to find two reliable works that I've included into the corpus. So this is not something that you should take for granted. This is more of a work in progress kind of thing. But you'll see that this is quite interesting indeed. You have this dendrogram. This is my initial thing, but I got very excited about it first. So you can see that there are many more texts in this corpus. However, I'm going to approach the board because that's the convenient way of explaining this. You can see that this is a text written by a translator, and it is among the translated texts. So even though this is a native Polish text, it is included in the corpus of translated text. So because it was written by a translator, I assume. So when we have this as being a Bartkow's text, now we have also quite a fresh text by Jarosław Rybski, who also is a literary translator. And his text also ended up on this end of the scale, meaning that those two texts, even though they're native Polish texts, they do have characteristics of translated texts, which is, I feel, very interesting. Now, I had to clean this corpus up a bit, because those corpora did have certain texts which have been translated by those two translators, and I thought this wouldn't be the case anymore. But in fact, when you limit the corpus, you have only the texts which are written, you have no other texts in the corpus which belong to Bartko and to Rybski. They still end up on the translated text end of scale, even though, as I said, they are native Polish texts. This is quite interesting. I need some more data, and I wonder how many of the authored native Polish texts will end up on the translated text end of the scale. But what is really intriguing is that those are the only ones that, that were classified as translations, even though they are not translations in fact at all. Okay. Another thing that you should probably pay attention to is that those translators, both of them, have translated 20 books or more before having produced a text of their own. So this is another quite interesting thing, which I feel translating kind of, in a sense, allows you to forge your style. And I feel that their style was heavily influenced by the fact that they were indeed translating a lot. And they ended up really producing texts which are statistically similar to the translated texts in Polish. Now I'm going to walk you through a few examples because I feel I'm running out of time. Am I?
It's 5 minutes.
5 minutes, right? I think I might slow down a bit then. Now, I'm going to walk you through, quite slowly then, through Jarosław Rybski's book, Warkot, which was published in 2017. I'm going to show you a few things about the book, which he did. Now we're going to have a look at something at an angle that is a bit different from what we're looking at so far, because we're going to look at how his work that he wrote himself compares to the translations he produced, right? So I'm going to walk you through the similarities, I think there are like 5 or 6 markers of style that I'm going to enumerate. Alright, so let's go through a bit. Now there is this notion of translator's intellect, which I feel appears in the corpus context in Dorothy Kenny's paper, Creatures of Habit, What Translators Usually Do with Words. And she indicates that translators might indeed have the style that they leave in the book, but she doesn't really provide any specific data there. I do have some data here at least. So let's have a look at this. So, alright. So there are a few peculiarities as far as Rybski's style goes. For instance, Rybski really likes using the word najwyraźniej. And this is a very, he has an incredibly high keenness score for this word because he uses it almost 5 times more often than any Polish writer and translator. And this is independent of, this is not an average value. I actually checked every single text in my corpus one by one, comparing those texts to Rybski's work, and for every single text, it was at least 5 times more often for Rybski than for a regular, Polish writer. Also, you can see that there's, so this was 250 keenness, meaning that this is very significant. Now there are other vocabulary items, like lexical words that he likes to overuse as well. So those are like those very strong markers of style. And mind you, those markers of style appear both in the text that he has written and in the text that he has translated, and they're very consistent across all those texts. So we have words such as z pewnością, so the translation would be roughly surely. Stać się, so it mostly is used in the, as if you were to say, it so happened that, and na temat, basically you could probably translate it as to pertaining to, in this particular context that he uses this word most often. So this means that every writer has certain lexical bias, as I said in the beginning, but this means that when a translator works with a text, they do also leave those certain elements of their own style in the translation. So this is quite an interesting idea, right? As far as the grammatical words go, we have, for instance, the conjunct kiedy, which he overuses as well. Mind you, kiedy is it means when, and it's of course used to describe the time when something happened. Now the thing about kiedy is that he uses it twice as often as any other Polish text. So this is an average value, so twice as often, and this means the keenness is 544, which is extremely high. This is quite unnatural, really, for a Polish text to have this kind of feature. He also uses ale very often. That's another grammatical word that he overuses. So you can see that he does leave his mark on the text, and this is something that every translator does, because I have studied I've conducted similar studies. Those are just examples, so I can't enumerate everything here. But I've also conducted studies for Piotr Cholewa's translations of Terry Pratchett, and Anna Malinowska-Grupińska's translations of Terry Pratchett's text, and those were the patterns I could find. Every single translator has their own style. They use certain vocabulary. They use certain constructions that that mean that any translation can be attributed to them if they've indeed performed that translation. Okay, so as far as the conclusions go, so I feel that firstly the translation needs, as far as the translation needs goes, texts do have certain marks. So when you have a text which has been written in Polish and a text that has been translated from English into Polish, those texts will be significantly different on the statistical corpus level. And you can enumerate the specific differences and talk about them as well. So I feel that, I'm still working on this, but I feel that translation needs does indeed exist to a certain extent. I'm not saying that it does interrupt the way you read text, because it's not visible with the naked eye, but when you take it to the statistical level, you can quite, with high degree of certainty, say that this text has been translated from English into Polish, and this text has been natively written in Polish. I also feel, because I've done some quite shallow research, so I did some research on the texts which have been translated from other languages into Polish. And those texts do seem to differ from the translations from English into Polish as well. But this is again work in progress, so I can't really say much more about them for now. Now, translator's style is likely to be influenced and defined by the translational activity he or she performs as well. So this means that, as I said, I feel, I do need some more data on this as well, that when translator does a lot of translator work and then they decide to write something of their own, their style will be shaped by the fact that they've been translating a lot in the past. Right. And also, as I said, translator's own style can be measured, it can be attributed. I'm not saying with ease, but it's definitely possible. So those are I think this is the final of the conclusions. So thank you for bearing with me. We did have a talk on bears today, so I couldn't help myself. Yeah, I guess I await your questions then.